And now on Rough Diamond Radio, we have part 2 of Hengist's Inheritance.
Chapter 5. Hengist arrived at the gasworks gates a quarter of an hour earlier than required, but the gates were already open with a few people milling around. Wallop Gas and Coke was not a large company. It had, at any one time, no more than 30 people working for it. That included office staff, meter readers, and the 10 or so stokers who kept the ovens going that made the gas to start with. Hengist walked through the yard, pushing open the door to the old blackened brick building that housed the administration staff and Mr. Frome's office. He looked at the clock on the wall in the small lobby. It showed 10 to 8. Thinking it better to be early than late, he crossed the room and rapped on the manager's door. On hearing, "Come in," Hengist opened the door and stuck his head into the office. "You wanted to see me this morning, Mr. Frome?" "Ah yes, Hengist, I do." "Please come in and take a seat," Mr. Frome said, placing the papers he'd been looking through on top one of the several piles that littered the large mahogany desk he sat behind. Hengist sat down facing his boss. "Right? I suppose you're wondering what all this is about," Mr. Frome said, sitting back in his chair and steepling his fingers across his chest. "Yes, sir." "Well, let me bring you up to speed. As you are aware, this country is now at war. So the powers that be have put regulations and procedures in place to deal with any unpleasant situation that may arise. A prudent course of action, I'm sure you agree." "Yes, sir, of course," Hengist agreed. "Good man. Well, over the past few weeks, Wallop-on-Sea Borough Council has been setting up, in line with government policy, a LRP. Are you aware what that is?" Hengist shook his head. "No, of course not. Why would you?" Mr. Frome explained. LURP stands for Local Utility Recovery Plan, which is, as its name suggests, a plan to restore any service utilities in the local area should they fail for any reason. Mr. Frome paused for effect, then added, "Air raids and such enemy action. You understand?" Hengist understood but wondered what the hell it had to do with him, but he replied with another safe "Yes, sir." To this end, each of the relevant managers of such utilities in the town, such as myself, have been instructed to select a person from their staff who has the desired technical knowledge and ability to represent their specific utility on the town's LRP committee. Mr. Frome again paused for a second or two before continuing. "And you, I know, Hengist, have the technical knowledge to oversee and correlate any such gas work that may be required. And you must agree, you are without doubt the most physically able of our engineers to take up such a position." Hengist did agree, but that wasn't saying much. Both the other gas fitters employed at Wallop Gas and Coke were over 60. Both suffered from recurring back trouble and piles respectively. "So you are the man to hold up the gas end of this LRP. What do you say?" Hengist was flustered. I'll help in any way I can, Mr. Frome, you know that, but I'm not sure what it all means. I'm not even sure what is expected of someone on a committee." "Well, if my experience of committees is anything to go by, it means you'll have to sit in a drafty room, and you'll be expected to try to stay awake." "No, what I mean is," Mr. Frome interrupted, "merely pulling your leg, Hengist. In a nutshell, all the major services and utilities, police, fire, ambulance, water, electricity, ARP, and of course, gas, should an emergency arise, need to work together to speedily reconnect or repair essential supplies. Knowing who the relevant person is for each utility and how to contact them, should help be required in any given situation, is paramount. And you, Hengist, my man, are to be that person in regards to gas. Then changing tack, he said, "Can you ride a motorbike?" Yes sir, I can. Spot on. And you or Mrs. Grump has no objections to having a telephone installed at home? No sir, not at all. Harriet would just love that, Hengist knew. Good, that's settled. The first meeting of the LERP committee is this coming Thursday at 6 p.m. at the Scout Hut on Ash Road, where I'm sure any further questions you have will be answered, Mr. Frome then quickly added. Oh yes, I believe the Scout Hut is also to be your assembly point in the event of an air raid. Before Hengist could inquire further into this point, Mr. Frome picked an envelope off his desk and held it out. Here's a letter for you to deliver to Mr. Fake down at the post office. He'll arrange the installation of the telephone at home for you. Hengist took the offered letter. Thank you, sir. Mr. Frome got up from his chair. The last thing to do before you can go home to enjoy what remains of your holiday is take you to your new transport. Follow me if you would, he said, striding out of the office. Hengist rushed after him. They walked out across the yard, its air sooty and sulphurous, and into a large shed. A few minutes passed, then a motor engine was heard to start up. Seconds later, Hengist rode out of the shed, on a new olive-green army motorbike and sidecar combination. Gas in large yellow letters was stenciled on the sidecar and fuel tank. He now also wore a leather flying-style helmet, gauntlets and goggles. He rode around the yard a few times, then pulled up next to Mr. Frome, who had watched from just outside the shed. Well, you seem to have the mark of that machine, but best you take it for a gentle spin to get the feel for it properly. Oh yes, and your new uniform is in that bag in the sidecar. So off you go and enjoy the rest of your holiday, and we'll speak again when you return to work. Yes, thank you, sir. One more thing, Hengist said, Mr. Frome smiling. Due to the extra workload on top of your normal duties, there's a pay increase of 5 shillings a week with this promotion. That should please the little lady at home, I think. And with that, Mr. Frome patted Hengist on the back and started back to his office. Hengist, lightly revving the engine, rode out of the yard and off down the road. Chapter 6. Hengist turned left out of the gasworks and headed towards the town. Riding down the high street to the harbor, he turned left onto the sea front and pulled up directly outside the post office. Swinging himself off the motorbike, he strode into the building and up to the counter. "Morning, Mrs. Fake, is your husband about, please?" he inquired. "Sorry, love, he's out on a call. Doctor's telephone isn't working," Mrs. Fake explained. "Not to worry, Mrs. Fake. Please, could you give him this letter as soon as he returns?" Removing a sealed brown envelope from inside his jacket, he handed it across the counter. "Will do, love." "About your new telephone, is it?" Mrs. Fake asked. "Yes, Mrs. Fake. Harriet will be chuffed to bits when I tell her." Hengist paused for a second, then asked, "But how did you know it's about me getting a new telephone installed? I only picked up the letter 5 minutes ago myself." Mrs. Fake looked at Hengist as if he was daft. "My Albert is on that LERP thingy, isn't he? Him being the only one who knows about telephones in the town." "Yeah, but how did you know it would be me, Mrs. Fake?" said Hengist, still puzzled. "My Albert was told, wasn't he, at the last LERP thingy meeting? So he told me to expect you in about it," Mrs. Fake said. "And besides, what sort of postmistress would I be if I didn't know what was going on in the town?" "Oh, I see. Was nothing private in this town, he thought? Well, I'd best be off, thank you, Mrs. Fake," Hengist said and started to leave, only to be called back. "Hengist, my dear, I see you have transport now," Mrs. Fake said, pointing to the motorbike combination through the window. "Yes, just got it this morning, in fact," Hengist said proudly. "Not going anywhere near Plumley Hall, are you?" Mrs. Fake asked in a tone of voice that implied, "Be careful how you answer, Sunbeam. Your future happiness depends on it." "Well?" Mrs. Fake carried on quickly before Hengist could answer. It's just, I have an urgent telegram that needs delivering, and it takes my Albert so long to cycle up there with his arthritis and all. She looked at Hengist, no response. Mrs. Fake went up a gear. And then there's his poor heart to consider. He's not as young as he used to be, you know. Hengist smiled. He did after all have permission to take the bike for a spin, and a trip up to Plumley Hall would be lovely on a day like this. No problem. Give it to me, I'll take it straight away, Mrs. Fake. The boss told me to take the bike for a ride anyway. Going for a ride then, is you? Oh well, you could drop this other telegram off at the lighthouse as you're going that way, couldn't you? Hengist knew when he was beaten. Of course I could, Mrs. Fake. You're a good lad, Hengist. I'll make sure your new phone is first on the list for tomorrow morning, Mrs. Fake said, and handed over both telegrams. Hengist took the proffered telegrams. Thought for a second or two, then asked, Mrs. Fake? Yes, dear? I was wondering, you knew what was in my letter before I did, right? Yes, dear. So do you know what this telegram says already? Mrs. Fake looked at Hengist as if he'd lost his mind for the second time that morning and said, Yes, of course I do, dear. Hengist left the shop. Back outside, Hengist found an old friend sitting on the new motorbike combination. It was Mark, the town's road sweeper. Saw you getting off, nice ain't it? He said. Yes it is. I just got it and I don't need you fucking with it, so get off. Hengist replied. Mark laughed and got off the bike. Hengist quickly hopped back on, adjusting his helmet and goggles. You out his weekend? Hengist inquired. Yeah, I guess so. Then remembering something, Mark added, Oh yes. Look at this, Hengist, my old mate. What is it? Hengist wanted to get off, but knew Mark was always finding odd or useful stuff while doing his round. Wait until you see this, it's something else I tell you, mate, Mark called over his shoulder as he returned to his road-sweeping trolley, where a grubby bag hung limply. Mark thrust his hand into the bag and pulled out a dog-eared book. Looking around conspiratorially, he handed the book to Hengist. Hengist read the title. Secrets of a French Bordello. Hengist looked up at Mark questioningly. Found it behind a bush in Church Avenue, wrapped in grease-proof paper. Look inside. Hengist flicked the book open at a random page. It showed a line drawing. It took Hengist a second or two to realize what he was looking at. He snapped the book shut, looking around to see if anyone was watching him. Bit raunchy. Hengist went to hand the book back. No, you keep it, I've read it. Twice. I bet you have, you dirty sod. Hengist, eager to get off, tucked the book in a bag in the sidecar that contained his new uniform. Well, got to get on, see you for a pint Saturday then, Hengist said. Kick-starting the bike. Mark slapped Hengist lightly on his back. I see you Saturday, he said, returning to his trolley. Hengist rode off towards Plumley Hall. Chapter 7. Plumley Hall had watched over Wallop-on-Sea seemingly forever. First built in 1560 by a wealthy merchant, Nicholas Plumley, to house his mistresses. It had stood as a silent witness to events in the town ever since. Over the ensuing decades, the hall had borne witness to many changes and events. Some happy, some of them tragic. Such as the death of Nicholas Plumley himself, who was mysteriously found dead at the bottom of the stairs with a dagger stuck in his back. On the very day his new 16-year-old mistress took up residence at the hall, and his wife and children paid him a surprise visit. The hall itself had not escaped structural change over the years either. Additions such as the building of the West Wing, the family chapel and crypt in the 1500s, and the stone tower built in 1776 to replace the wooden one that burnt down that summer, and the installing of an electrical system, to name but a few. Regardless of these alterations, Plumley Hall remained without doubt the most prestigious and impressive building in Wallop-on-Sea. And miraculously, it had somehow managed to stay in the Plumley family. The number of staff employed at the hall also had fluctuated. In more recent times, the number of staff had reduced from its high point at the turn of the century, when there were 24 permanent staff members and numerous others employed on a part-time basis, to its current staffing level of a housekeeper, a butler, a part-time gardener, and a maid who came in when needed. This reduction in staff was without doubt indicative of the general decline in the prominence of such houses as the hall in the social life of the country. The one individual who could be said to be responsible for the largest single reduction in the staff of Plumley Hall was one Herr Ludovic Gartz, a 22-year-old bus driver from Dusseldorf, who on the morning of July 1, 1916, from the comfort of his machine gun nest, managed to remove from Plumley Hall's staff list 2 gardeners, 1 underfootman, 2 stable lads, and a groom, as the Pals Brigade from Wallop-on-Sea went over the top on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The 6 people-sized holes on the staff list were never to be filled. Nobody in Wallop-on-Sea knew of Herr Gartz, or indeed knew he was responsible for this little bit of carnage. Also knowing Herr Gartz himself shuffled off his mortal coil the next day with the help of an exploding shell would have been of very little solace to the grieving parents and lovers anyway. However, one member of staff who escaped Herr Gartz's aim and returned to Plumley Hall was Algernon Pringle. Algernon Kitchener Pringle was taken into the service at the hall at the tender age of 13, filling the lowly position of stable boot boy. But after years of hard work, by 1922, he had risen to the position in the household of under-butler. It was at this time that a sprightly young lass named Mabel Grisel was taken on as kitchen maid. A relationship developed between the two. This relationship blossomed in secret for a full 2 years, until Sir Tarquin Plumley, the master of Plumley Hall, was made aware of it, thanks to a spiteful gardener who Pringle was forced to reprimand. Sir Tarquin would have liked to have let sleeping dogs lay. The couple's work was faultless, but such a relationship between members of staff could not be entertained. His hands were tied. Therefore, he summoned the lovers into his study. The normal practice expected at the time was to instantly dismiss one of the parties and reprimand the other. However, Sir Tarquin Plumley was a fair-minded man and even more so a realist. Both Mabel and Algernon were good workers who could without a doubt be trusted. This situation was not to be dismissed lightly. The hall was, as Sir Plumley knew all too well, short-staffed, and good staff was hard to come by. Only last month he had had to dismiss the butler for excessive drinking and touching up the female members of staff. He still had been unable to find a suitable replacement. Then when, during the interview in his study, it was pointed out that the betrothal of the 2 stargaze lovers had been planned but postponed until the coming spring, to take into account the hall's busy schedule, stressing there was no attempt to deceive their employer. They were simply waiting an appropriate time to inform him that would cause the least inconvenience. Sir Tarquin Plumley realized that to dismiss such staff would be a folly indeed. Nevertheless, things could not be left as they were. The couple was not surprised when it was pointed out to them by Sir Tarquin that such a situation could not continue. And should Pringle like to remain at the hall in his current position, Mabel would have to find other employment elsewhere in the town. But the lovers were knocked sideways when the alternative was offered by Sir Tarquin. That being, should they prefer to set a date for the wedding as soon as possible, and once the ceremony was completed, they could take up the positions of cook, housekeeper, and butler respectfully at Plumley Hall. Sir Plumley also would be prepared to alter the servant quarters, to give the married couple their own apartment to live apart from the other staff. Adding, should they wish to take this option, he would be pleased to place the family chapel at the hall at their disposal for the service. At this revelation, Mabel started to weep with joy. It was left to Pringle to stammer out acceptance of the suggestion and offer their most heartfelt thanks. It was then 3 weeks later that Algernon Kitchener Pringle married Mabel Grisel in the family chapel at Plumley Hall. Sir Tarquin even arranged the Flying Duck, a hostelry in the town. He owned it after all for the reception. Then after a week in Bognor Regis on honeymoon, the new butler and housekeeper took up residence in the new married quarters and their new positions at the hall. It was not only the newly married couple who benefited from this arrangement. Sir Tarquin Plumley had gained the undying loyalty and thanks of both his housekeeper and butler. That was 18 years ago. Sir Tarquin was now in his 60s, Pringle was still butler and Mabel the housekeeper. Chapter 8. The few miles of country lanes between the post office and Plumley Hall soon passed. Hengist turned off the main road onto the drive that led around to the hall itself. The tires of the motorbike and sidecar crunched over the gravel-surfaced drive as the hall came into view. With its aged sandstone walls, mullioned windows and ivy-encrusted conical tower, Plumley Hall portrayed a majesty and the sense of permanence that had never failed to impress Hengist even as a boy. Plumley Hall held fond memories for Hengist. As a young lad, he worked there as a beater on the hall's pheasant shoots, picked apples, pears, and plums in the orchard each harvest for some extra pocket money. And at the age of 16, there was that memorable afternoon spent in the potting shed with a red-haired traveling fruit picker. But Hengist's association with the hall didn't stop with picking fruit and being instructed in the ways of the flesh by a buxom woman 15 years his senior. He had also worked at the hall for weeks while serving his apprenticeship. Even now not a month passed without Hengist being sent there to undertake some job or other. A building that size always needs some work doing. Even Harriet had worked at the hall, in the kitchens to help out when Mabel the housekeeper twisted her ankle. Hengist liked Plumley Hall, he had friends there. Riding the motorbike slowly around to the rear of the hall, he parked near the kitchen door. Then dismounting, he strode through the open door into the familiar whitewashed, high-ceilinged kitchen. Its rows of glistening copper pans hanging on the walls, and steam slowly rising from the stockpot sitting on the range. There in front of the range was the substantial rear view that belonged to Mabel the cook-cum-housekeeper. She was in the process of removing a tray from one of the ovens. "Hello, hello, what have we here then?" Hengist called out. I recognized that smile. Mabel straightened up quickly and turned around. On seeing who had called out, her face broke into a beaming smile. "Hengist, my love. Lovely to see you again. What brings you up here today, and how is the lovely Harriet?" Not waiting for an answer, went on. "Whatever it is, you've time for a cup of tea, no doubt?" "Oh yes, always time for a cuppa," Hengist replied. "And with your tea, would you like?" Mabel placing the tray she had just removed from the oven on the vast scrubbed table. "Some freshly made shortbread. I seem to remember you're a bit partial to that." Hengist looked at the tray and the wonderfully warm, lightly colored shortbread it held. He quickly crossed the room, dropping to one knee, and taking the housekeeper's hand said, "Now that would make my spirits soar, my buxom temptress." Mabel, giggling, pushed him away. "Bloody silly sod," she laughed, stepping back and straightening out her apron. "You don't change a bit, do you? Daft as a box of frogs. Sit down, I'll pour you some tea. Help yourself to some shortbread." "Will do, luscious," Hengist replied, seating himself down. The next few minutes were taken up laying out some plates and brewing the tea. When they finally were both sat down at the table, Mabel started the conversation. This was mostly due to Hengist's inability to talk, his mouth being full of shortbread. "Now then, how is married life suiting you and the lovely Harriet?" "Just fine, Mabel. Just got to work out what to do with the clean underpants each morning, and life will be just swell," said Hengist, giving the table a light sprinkling of shortbread crumbs as he spoke. Just then a door opened into the kitchen from the main house, and Pringle the butler entered. "Cup of tea, my love?" Mabel asked her husband. "Yes, please, Mabel," he answered, walking to the table and sitting down. "Hengist, my boy, what brings you up here?" "Not that it's not a pleasure to see you again, that is if you've not eaten all the shortbread?" Pringle said, looking at the several gaps on the baking tray, where there once used to be shortbread. Hengist guiltily brushed crumbs off his shirt front. Mrs. Fake down at the post office asked me to deliver this telegram, Mr. Pringle, he said, removing the telegram from his pocket and held it out. Pringle took it from him. Do we know what it's about then? Mabel asked. Pringle looked at her. How could we know what's it's about, woman? It's a sealed telegram, he admonished his wife. That's as maybe, my love, but I bet Dorcas Fake down at the post office knows what it says. Hengist muttered agreement through yet another piece of shortbread. Don't be foolish, Mabel, it's against the law to tamper with the Royal Mail, and I'm sure Mrs. Fake wouldn't dream of it, Pringle said. A knowing look passed between Hengist and Mabel, who simply rolled her eyes at her husband's naive statement. Pringle ignored this and continued. I'll give it to Sir Tarquin presently, Hengist. But it will more than likely be passed on to his brother Ronald Plumley to deal with. I'm afraid to say Sir Tarquin seems less and less able to deal with anything these days. Oh, not ill, is he? Inquired Hengist with genuine concern. He liked the old boy. It was Mabel who answered. Well, the doctor says there's nothing wrong with him medically. He just seems to be giving up on life, and he's so unhappy. Maybe he's getting that age where everything gets too much, said Hengist. Mabel jumped to her employer's defense. Rubbish. He's lonely. He should have had a family of his own to fill his life. A man needs a wife to support and care for him. It was okay when he was younger. He filled his days at his club, running the stables and doing his Egyptian thingy. Egyptology, Pringle corrected her. Yes, that, she continued. But now he's older, he has nothing to get up for. And he used to be so full of life, now he just sits at the window staring into space. He's even lost interest in the estate. Why didn't he marry then? Hengist asked. I imagine he'd be quite a catch back in the day. Lady Jennifer Tavistock. It was Pringle's time to roll his eyes. God, not that old chestnut again, he groaned. Lady Jennifer Tavistock, Hengist asked. Mabel explained. Jennifer Summerfield as she was, Lady Jennifer Tavistock as is now. Was Sir Tarquin's first and seemingly only love, they were besotted with each other. They would have without doubt married and been blissfully happy, if not for her damn father. Mabel? Pringle interrupted his wife. Well, he was not very nice. Adding with a sigh, it would all be fine now if he'd married Lady Tavistock, but her father refused to allow it, Mabel said, and Lord Plumley never got over it. Good grief, woman, that was 30-odd years ago, Pringle admonished his wife. 30 years, 30 days, such things die hard, my love. Nevertheless, she married Lord Tavistock, did she not? Pringle said. Yes, but only because that old bastard her father made her. And I hear they've never been happy anyway. Lord Tavistock drinks and gambles, they say. It's a crying shame. All water under the bridge now, I'm afraid, Pringle said. Mabel sadly nodded her head in agreement. Hengist changed the subject. So, Sir Tarquin's brother is basically running things now then, he said. Yes, and that's going to end in tears. What he gets up to in the West Wing, God alone knows. The comings and goings at all hours. Only I'm allowed in to clean, and then only once a week. What's that all about, I ask you? Hengist had unwittingly touched a raw nerve with Mabel. She continued. He comes into my kitchen, takes his food, and leaves without a please or thank you, and he is most rude when he does speak. He is a most difficult person to deal with. Yes, muttered Pringle. His loyalty to the family conflicting with the urge to say that Ronald Plumley was, in fact, a dishonest, dislikable, and repulsive individual. Pringle was saved from comment. At the sound of several large diesel engines could be heard approaching. The three of them went outside and around to the front of the hall, to be greeted by a small convoy of 20-ton army trucks, 2 of which were towing some sort of 2-barreled gun, coming to a halt on the gravel. Hengist turned to Pringle. I think you just found out what's in that letter. Certainly, looks like it, doesn't it? answered Pringle. Soldiers started to jump down from the van and mill around. The passenger door of the first truck opened, and a fresh-faced officer stepped out and came across to the three gobsmacked onlookers. "Good morning. I'm Captain Fanshawe of the 21st Battery of the 4th Anti-Aircraft Regiment. I believe you're expecting us." "Actually, no, Captain," said Pringle. "No. This is Plumley Hall?" "Yes, it is, Captain. But I have a feeling this letter which has just arrived was the notification of your pending arrival," Pringle said. "Oh, damn bad show that," said Captain Fanshawe, continuing. "Well, we're here now, and we'll try and be as unobtrusive as possible." Then, turning back to his men, shouted, "Sergeant." "Yes, sir," came a bellowed reply, and a bull of a man trotted over from the assembled group of soldiers. "Number 3 gun on the slope the other side of those trees," Captain Fanshawe said, pointing across the lawn, "and number 4 50 yards further around the headland." "Yes, sir." The sergeant saluted and turned back towards the men, shouting a list of commands. "And Sergeant?" "Yes, sir," said the sergeant, turning around. "Place the command trucks under those trees behind number 1, and get Wilkins to contact number 2 battery to confirm their arrival at the lighthouse." "Yes, sir," came the reply. On seeing the 3 blank faces staring at him, Captain Fanshawe added by way of explanation, "When we have these guns and the others on the opposite headland set up, if Jerry comes over, we'll teach him a lesson, what?" "I better inform Sir Tarquin of your arrival, Captain," Pringle said. "Sir Tarquin is lord of the manor, so to speak, I take it?" Captain Fanshawe asked. "That is correct, Captain," answered Pringle. "Well, could you give my regards to Sir Tarquin? Ask him if I could have a word with him at his convenience to bring him up to speed and sort out the details we require," Captain Fanshawe asked. "As you request, Captain. If you will excuse me, I will do so presently." Pringle turned towards the hall. "Yes, thank you. I'm sure we all have things to do. Good day to you, gentlemen, and you too, dear lady." Captain Fanshawe saluted again and turned back to his men. Hengist and Mabel returned to the kitchen to finish their tea. This done, Hengist gave Mabel a peck on the cheek, retrieved the gift of shortbread Mabel had given him for Harriet, and made his way back to his motorbike. He put his helmet on, pushed the shortbread into the bag with the book Mark had given him, adjusted his goggles, and soon he was heading back to town. Hengist's next stop was home for lunch, then on to Wallop Head Lighthouse. Chapter 9. Pringle briskly walked back to the kitchen, picked the telegram off the table, then left through the door that led to the main part of the hall. He passed through the hallway with its oak paneling and portraits of Plumley's past, and then trudged up the ornate staircase. On reaching the landing, he turned right down a wide corridor whose walls were lined with items collected during Sir Tarquin travels in Egypt. Pringle stopped at a door that differed from the others on the corridor, due to a black polished granite statue of the Egyptian goddess Isis, positioned on either side. Pringle then straightened his back and puffed out his chest and knocked the door. He received no reply. He knocked again. Again he received no reply. He knocked the door for a third time. This time, however, he turned the door knob and slowly entered the bedroom. "Sir Tarquin, sir," Pringle said in low tones. The room was large and lavishly furnished. Pringle found his employer seated in a plush armchair. He was partially silhouetted against the light that flooded into the room from the 4 large French windows that went from floor to ceiling. Pringle coughed in the hope of getting Sir Tarquin's attention. It worked. Sir Tarquin turned his head and looked at his butler. "Ah, Pringle, it's you," he said. "Sorry to disturb you, sir, but you have an urgent telegram." Pringle then crossed the room and held out the telegram. "I believe it may have something to do with the military unit currently on the front lawn, sir," he added. Sir Tarquin slowly took the telegram from his butler, rose out of his chair, and approached the window that overlooked the drive and front lawn. "I see what you mean," Sir Tarquin said, his voice holding not a glimmer of interest. "The officer in charge asked if he may have a few words with you at your convenience, sir." Sir Tarquin handed the unopened telegram back to Pringle. "Ask my brother to deal with this if you would be so kind, Pringle," he said, then gestured to the breakfast tray brought up earlier. "You may clear away now." "Yes, sir," Pringle replied, placing the telegram onto the tray and carried it to the door. Reaching to the door, he stopped, turned around. "Shall I run your bath, sir?" he asked. "No, maybe later, Pringle," came the reply. "Very well, sir." Pringle opened the door and left the room. Sir Tarquin lowered himself back into his chair. With a heavy heart, Pringle started his return journey to the kitchen. As he came down the stairs, he caught sight through the windows of Ronald Plumley striding towards the army trucks. Placing the breakfast tray down on the hall table, he opened the front door and headed off to intercept the disliked brother. "Mr. Plumley? Mr. Plumley?" Ronald Plumley turned to see who was calling him. "What the hell is going on here, Pringle?" he said, throwing his arm out in the direction of the trucks and soldiers. "I think this may explain, sir. I just spoken to Sir Tarquin and he asked if you would deal with it," said Pringle, holding out the telegram. Ronald Plumley let out a derisory snort and snatched the telegram off the butler, ripped it open and started to read. "For God's sake," Ronald Plumley exclaimed. "It appears that we are to have this rabble billeted with us here for the duration. By order of the MOD, no less." He looked up to see an officer walking towards them. "Sir Tarquin, I presume. Captain Fanshawe at your service, sir." "You presume wrong, Captain. I am Ronald Plumley, Sir Tarquin's brother. He has asked me to search for correct word, liaise with you over this matter." Jolly good, Captain Fanshawe replied. "I'm sorry to spring this on you, sir. We will try and be as unobtrusive as possible." "That'll be a novelty, given the state of the front lawn at the moment, and you having been here only 10 minutes, snorted Ronald Plumley. Captain Fanshawe ignored the comment. "The thing is, gentlemen, as you can see, we have orders to set up an air defensive position here. Now my men will be self-sufficient in all supplies. But we do require sleeping accommodation for the crew on duty, which will be approximately 8 men and the officer in charge. Also, access to the roof of the tower will be required at all times." "Access to the tower? What the hell for?" blustered Ronald Plumley. "Observation post, sir." "Good God, we can't have hordes of hobnail-booted troops tramping over the hall, man." There was an awkward silence. Pringle said, "Well, there's the old stable block, sir." "What was that, Pringle?" "The old stable block, sir. Maybe the crew could sleep in there. Also, there is access to the tower through the chapel, which has a door direct to outside. So the men have no need to enter the hall at all." "Sounds ideal, gentlemen," Captain Fanshawe agreed. Ronald Plumley sighed. "I suppose we have no choice, do we?" he said to nobody in particular. Then added, "Sort it, Pringle. And keep your men away from the west wing, Captain." Not waiting for a reply, he turned and stomped away. "Pleasant sort of chap," Captain Fanshawe said with more than a hint of sarcasm. "Yes, sir," Pringle agreed. "I'll go and put things in motion, if you'd excuse me, Captain." "Of course, sir," came the reply. Both men went about their duties. Chapter 10. Harriet was busying herself cleaning the kitchen when she heard an unfamiliar engine sound. She looked out of the kitchen window to see Hengist pulling up and parking the motorbike combination alongside the garden fence. Quickly drying her hands on her apron, she scurried to meet her husband. Removing his goggles, Hengist retrieved a cloth bag from the sidecar, swung his leg over the bike, and started towards the house. "What in God's name is all this?" Harriet exclaimed, wavering both hands towards the vehicle to emphasize her question. "This is my suite is a sign off my rising status in this metropolis of Wallop-on-Sea," said Hengist with mock arrogance. "You what?" "Put the kettle on and grab me a bit of bread and cheese. I'll explain all." Back in the kitchen, Harriet clattered the kettle under the tap, then filled it was quickly put on a gas ring. "Well, what's it all about?" she blurted out as she readied the teapot and cups. Hengist, smiling, placed the cloth bag down on the floor and hung up his work jacket, This done, he wrapped his arms around Harriet, nestling his face into her neck. "Firstly, I must say, you get more attractive each and every day, and I have 3 questions for you, my sweet," he muttered from under her chin. "And they are," Harriet replied, making not the slightest attempt of stopping his advances. 1. Did you miss me this morning? 2. What's for dinner this evening? I'm starving already. And 3. Is there any chance of a bit tonight? The last question Hengist emphasized by grabbing a handful of Harriet's hips and pulled her towards him. Harriet, chuckling, disengaged herself from her husband's clutches, giving him a kiss on the cheek while steering him into a kitchen chair. She replied, punctuating each number with a kiss. 1, as always. 2, lamb stew. And 3, who knows? If you play your cards right, you randy sod. That's my girl, said Hengist approvingly, patting his wife's rump. Now what's with the motorbike and this? Harriet lightly took hold of the buff-colored boiler suit. She then noticed the cloth bag Hengist had brought in. What's in the bag? If it's chocolates for me, I'd say your chances of having a bit tonight just improved. Sorry to disappoint, Petal. Then with a mischievous smirk, Hengist added, it's a new hat. A new hat? You know I don't wear hats. Unless I must. The last bit was said almost dreamily, as Harriet relived the memory of being told by a less than tactful family member at a wedding that Harriet in a hat always reminded them of a donkey on Brighton Beach. Hengist pulled her back from the unsettling memory. It's not for you, it's for me. Hengist jumped up, picked the bag off the floor, opened it, and removed an army tin helmet painted bright yellow with the word gas in big black writing on it. What the bloody hell is that? Harriet said, placing a steaming cup of tea before Hengist. This and the bike is my new badge of office, my sweet. I am, as of today, the Wallop-on-Sea's Utilities Emergency Officer. Gas. Hengist put the helmet on and sat back down in a self-congratulatory pose. Harriet had played this game with Hengist before. Would you like to explain, or shall I beat it out of you? Or indeed, I could just withdraw my womanly favors at bedtime, if an explanation is not forthcoming quick enough. Hengist explained. The government, in its divine wisdom, has decided to form several emergency units to assure the supply of essential services to the priority users of water, electric and... He pointed at the black letters on the helmet, gas, in the event of an enemy attack. Why you? Harriet asked, baffled. Simple, my sweet. My superior experience and depth of the technical expertise, coupled with my considerable local knowledge and social standing within the community, made me the only suitable choice. Harriet looked at him quizzically. Hengist then added, I do admit though that the fact that Terence Good was too old, Wesley can't ride the bike because of his piles, and both live where they can't get in a telephone line to them, may have played a part. Judged by Harriet's expression, Hengist considered that further explanation was required. This means, he continued, that should Hitler take a dislike to this tranquil haven we call Wallop-on-Sea, and sends his despicable airborne hordes over to disrupt the vital work being undertaken in Wilson's jam factory, or indeed destroy Spittle and Down's new formula for boot polish, it is yours truly who will be responsible at the outbreak of such hostilities to, and I quote, make safe any damaged gas supplies, repairing and reconnecting at the soonest opportunity, on a priority basis, such supplies that are required to ensure the fabric of our free society continues to function. He paused and looked again at Harriet. She thought for a while, then said, But isn't that what you do already? Ah yes, my love, but now I'll be in part working for the government and not just WGC. And therefore, getting 5 shillings a week extra for my troubles. And the best bit for us is... He paused for effect. I am now officially a priority worker, and cannot therefore be conscripted. Hengist thought it best to skip over the fact that should the bombs indeed start to fall, he wouldn't be expected to tuck himself with his family up under the stairs in relative safety, but required to ride around the streets with the fire and ambulance services, with all the accompanying danger and risks. What, they can't call you up to go to war? Nope, I'm here for the duration, my pet. They both looked at each other, Then Harriet's eyes filled with tears and she looked down at the table. Hengist knew, although nothing had been said, that him being called up was a fear they both shared. Hengist reached over table, placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, squeezing gently. "I know, pet. It was worrying me too, but now there is no problem, is there?" Harriet sniffed, and lifting her head back and wiped her face with the back of her hand, composing herself, she said, No, that's great news, love," she said, sipping her cup of tea. Then, as more of what Hengist had said sunk in, "You said they couldn't get a telephone line to Wesley's. Does that mean they can get a telephone here?" "Yes, my love, the people will be here tomorrow to install our new telephone, because as you are aware, a person of my importance to the community must be kept informed at all times of any developments in the area." He smiled. Harriet mulled over this news. "That will ruffle a few feathers. I hear the Mr. and Mrs. Brett from number 16 has been waiting over a year to be connected." Then with a shrug of her shoulders said, "Ah well, they'll live. Mind you, sweetheart," she looked up at Hengist, "that yellow helmet doesn't half make you look daft." Hengist smiled, lifted his hand up, removing the helmet. He leaned across the table and handed it to Harriet. "It might look daft on me, but I tell you what, after dinner tonight you nip upstairs, strip down to your lace knickers, and put the helmet on, and I'll give an honest opinion of what you look like wearing it, my petal." "You would too," guffawed Harriet. It was then that Hengist heard a scratching sound from the sitting room door. "What the hell?" Hengist started to get up and go to look where the sound was coming from. But Harriet was quicker off the mark, and reached the door to the sitting room first as the scratching got louder. We have a lodger for a few days, my love." "You what?" By way of explanation, Harriet opened the sitting room door, and a scruffy lurcher dog trotted in, tail wagging and his nails tapping out a staccato on the ox blood-colored quarry tiles that made up the kitchen floor. "What the hell?" He looked at the dog, then up to Harriet. It's like this, my love. I was on my way to the shops to get something for our dinner, and Mr. Graspy, from the end house, you know him," she continued before Hengist could confirm her statement. "Well, he came out of his front door to say something to me." She paused. "Well? What did he say?" "I don't know, because he tripped over his doormat and fell headfirst into that little ornamental fish pond he has. Oh, Hengist, it was terrible. He had water weeds in his hair and down his shirt. And he did stink. We had to call an ambulance, and they wouldn't take him in the ambulance because they said they had just cleaned it and didn't want it messed up and smelling like a 3-week dead otter. Mrs. Brett and I had to throw 4 or 5 buckets of clean water over him before the ambulance men would take him to hospital. But as they took him off, he begged me to take care of his dog. What could I say? I'm sure it will only be for a couple of days, my sweet." Hengist knew he'd been given a fait accompli, and therefore not much point in making a fuss. "I hope the bleeder is house-trained, that's all." Soon the bread and cheese were eaten, and the tea drunk. Hengist then kissed Harriet and was off to the lighthouse.